Welcome to Janice Edwards TV, Bay Area Vista. I'm Janice Edwards, and thank you so much for joining us today. On our show today, we are focusing on climate change, our global climate crisis. As a matter of fact, this is one of two shows that's focusing on that, and one of our guests is speaking this week at the United Nations Climate Change Summit. So the conversations that we're focusing on today took place before the summit, but it's very timely in terms of all that's going on. This show, like many shows, has developed from a series of conversations that actually began earlier this year when I had retired Colonel Dr. Carl Hunt and retired Colonel Dennis Greene on the show to talk about Paradoxes of Power, their book that discussed failed leadership.
The idea of paradoxes of power revolve around the use and misuse of power in leadership positions. And I just felt like if we don't teach our younger generations what it means to acquire and exercise power and good leadership, we're really letting them down. And of course, we're harming significantly the future of the United States.
I believe that we can get past this. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of education. It's going to take truth. And that's what we need right now, Janice. We need truth. We need truth and accountability. You know, I'm hearing a lot about, well, we need to move on. We need to reconcile. We need truth right now because truth precedes reconciliation.
That conversation took place a week after the January 6th insurrection. So a lot of it focused on failed leadership in politics. But we also wanted to talk about concerns with the environment and religion. That earlier show can be seen on our YouTube channel. After that first show featuring Paradoxes of Power, Dr. Hunt and I continued to talk about actions that could be taken to help people feel empowered to work together, to look toward solutions, especially regarding the environment. I invited him to bring his colleagues from Paradoxes of Power, his co-authors, and to have a discussion about some of the initiatives that they have been working on. And some of those private discussions that they've had will now be made public in our show. This is the first of two shows that's dealing with this climate crisis. So I started the show with giving background on all of our guests, and then Carl provided a framework for the discussion. Now, Carl holds a Ph.D. from George Mason University, and in one of his recent articles, he collaborated with his longtime colleague and friend, Dr. Stuart Kauffman, who's a medical doctor, a MacArthur Fellow, and emeritus professor of biochemistry and biophysics at the University of Pennsylvania, the author of 6 books, 350 articles, and those are just a few of his credits. I also want to introduce our third guest today, who is theologian and minister Mike Gottschalk. He is founding a new kind of church. And Mike studied fine art at the University of Minnesota Duluth and theology for 3 years at Crown College, Minnesota. He is on the forefront of reimagining church, and he and Stuart have collaborated for years on articles regarding theology and science.
Thank you, Janice, and greetings to my friends. And I would start quickly with just a brief review of Paradoxes of Power in the sense that it was an effort to demonstrate how people have lost the bubble, if you will, on what leadership actually means and how they introduce paradox, which means confusion or contradictions in the leadership followership relationships. And this applies not only to the social people parts, but also to the environment, as we discussed earlier. Stu and I go back a very long way, 25 years as a matter of fact. Stu was my dissertation director as I was finishing up at George Mason University way back when. And we have been friends for a very long time and have co-authored a number of articles primarily on this very topic here because we share a distinctive concern, I guess, about what is happening to the environment, what is happening to global nation relationships because we are reacting so poorly to the opportunities that have been presented to us which Stu will go into, to correct some of the environmental decisions that we've made. And I'm very delighted to have Mike join us. I haven't known Mike all that long, but most impressed with his positions on how spirituality and religion might play into helping us increase our capacity to understand and cope and deal and correct with the type of environmental issues that we face today. As we will discuss, religion has certainly played a distinctive role going all the way back to the book of Genesis, and the way that many have perceived we were instructed to take over the earth's responsibility for the earth. And I'm delighted that we'll have a chance to talk about that. So just in review, very quickly, a paradox has to do with introducing a surprising contradiction. And as Stu will demonstrate with his thinking about what we call the theory of the adjacent possible, we'll be able to understand how we've introduced these contradictions in our understanding to begin with of what we have done to the environment, and the consequential changes that have occurred because of what we call the Anthropocene, or the era of humanity. So with that, I think I've probably introduced things reasonably well.
Yes, you did a great job with that. Thank you, Carl, for that. And so, Stu, you have had this theory that you call TAP. That is an important part of it. But why don't we start with your overall sense of what needs to happen most immediately to stop what we're seeing with the climate crisis?
Janice, thank you so much for doing this, and to Carl, who's organized it, and to my old friend Mike. We talk maybe once a week for years. We are in a situation where what we are confronting is a crisis that's global in scale, it's civilizational in scale, really is existential. The overall problem is our global economy, Janice, and nobody's talking about this. It's kind of captured in this equation that I wrote, but here it is. Our global economy is now about 120 trillion, growing at about 3% a year, leaving out COVID right now. It's exploded upward in the last 80 or 100 years, almost vertically. The global economy is the result of 300,000 years of our technological and cultural evolution, and it's wonderful. It binds nations in trade. It's how we earn our living. It's lifting people from poverty. It's extending lifespan. It's how we find a lot of the meaning in our lives. The trouble is the same economy is a juggernaut. It just keeps growing. And that growth is simultaneously leading to the climate change we're focusing on, but it's also leading to mass extinctions because we're invading every habitat on the planet, in part because we're using up soil. And because we're invading habitats, we're unleashing pandemics all over the planet and the world, COVID-19 now. We are confronting something that we're not ready to confront. We're all aware of climate change. We're just not taking in that it's the economy. Bill Clinton says it's the economy, stupid. It's the global economy which is laying havoc to the biosphere. We're destroying 3.7 billion years of accumulated know-how in an evolving biosphere. It's expected, and you probably have seen this, Janice, and I know that Carl and Mike have, the UN estimates that in about 30 years, 1 million species will be dead, gone, extinct, and meanwhile, their population levels are dropping. And meanwhile, there's almost 10 billion of us using 40% of the surface of the planet to grow our foods, and about 50% or 60% of the planetary surface biomass of terrestrial is us and our cows and our pigs and our chicken and our sorghum and our wheat. We're overwhelming the planet. We're at the carrying capacity of the planet, and the chance that we can face it is slim unless two things happen. We need a profound spiritual change, that we are of nature, not above it, and then we have to find out how to be creative have an economy, and not destroy the biosphere. It's huge, Janice.
It is huge. And I think that one of the challenges is when you talk about the economy and we look at the food supply and the shortages that are and the ones that are predicted to come.
Yep.
And so the question becomes, how do we continue to make sure that people have what is needed to survive and at the same time are not at war with nature?
Rather by accident, I find myself involved with some stunning people. A man named John Crawford at the University of Glasgow, who's involved for years about soil and soil restoration. Another man named Gary Metcalf, Lars Larsson in Sweden, and Per Holmgren, a senior Swedish Green politician in the EU Parliament. We are right now trying to formulate what we're calling a global creative commons for the soil, in which we can invoke experiments on plots around the world to find better combinations of crops using combinatorial optimization techniques that are done now, trying to find good combinations of crops. You know, beans, squash, and corn helped one another. Well, if you could get crops that help one another, you don't need as much fertilizer. So we could try to do experiments to find good combinations of plants all around the world that are different. It'll be different in Kentucky than it is in Bangladesh, which form, in effect, permacultures that the plants can help one another, make rooted soil that restores the soil. John Crawford points out something that's amazing. If we were to restore the soil to real health, it would sequester roughly the amount of CO2 that we need to sequester. So one of the things to do now, Janice, is to fall in love with soil restoration around the planet and mobilize resources to do it. I think it's
So
possible.
soil restoration sounds a little bit like what we used to hear about crop rotation so that the soil was allowed to replenish itself and not be depleted by having the same crops grown over and over.
Yes, and more. That's certainly true. I'm not an expert on this, but well, just think of beans, squash, and corn in the American Southwest, where the beans fix nitrogen and make amino acids, and the corn makes sugar, and they trade them. It's a market in the economy. Therefore, they help one another. And well-constructed forests secrete chemicals when they're being attacked by insects. All of that's lost in monoculture. So we're stuck in monoculture, and one of the things that's dawning on me is if you have monoculture, you have global commodity prices for everything. Well, that makes every farmer fragile to global commodity prices, and therefore we need subsidies. And monoculture has lots of problems. Can we experiment, find better ways, find ways of getting, in effect, corn, bean, and squash underway, new ways of planting, harvesting, and tending to soil, and lift millions of people from poverty by having them invent new ways to do things so that people come out of poverty by becoming inventors and producers that have their hands on capital, which increases in value a lot faster than wages, and transform the way we're doing it. There's something.
Yes, that's a transformation in so many
Yeah.
ways. And I think that that's part of the resistance that we see. And Mike, I'd love to hear your thoughts now.
Well, hi, and thanks again for doing this. And the first thing I want to say after just listening to Stu right now is, just how much I love the man. It's been extraordinary, the work that we've been doing together over the last years. And each of us pushing through anomalies from our respective disciplines, not to find some kind of kumbaya moment, but just to find a whole higher order of understanding of what we're doing here. And one of the big changes for me has been looking at the biblical texts that describe this demise of human existence on the planet. And I'm watching conservative Christians who, love the idea of heaven, thrill at the idea of the second coming of Jesus. And I look at that scenario in the way it's described. And I liken it to parents who go away for a weekend for the first time, leaving their kids home alone. And when they come back, the house is trashed. And I'm thinking, well, I don't want to be that person. And so if there is some kind of second coming event, instead of a broom, let Jesus come back with a thumbs up that, his time on the cross wasn't wasted. And so a big change I make theologically is from ancient history, this place that Stu calls the biosphere, referred to as the pale blue dot, has been regarded as something tertiary, a third-rate place. And through a crazy turn of events, my life, instead of being in academia, was really involved in elements of design and engineering. And so now, instead of seeing this place as something tertiary, I just think it's absolutely genius. And when there is some kind of fallenness, it's not from some perfection on high. It's from this genius that we're just innately engulfed in.
What actions can people take, if any? And then how do we work together to really have impact, so that if the way of farming is going to change, and our communities are going to change, what are the steps to take? What are your thoughts? I'll start with you, Carl.
That is such a great framing environment that you pose here, Janice. And one of the reasons I felt like the discussion of nature and climate change and the environment fit so nicely in Paradoxes of Power, because it is a leadership failure on our part. We have not taken seriously the admonition, not only from God and religion, but just from our own wisdom that we've accrued over these years, to exercise leadership. Leadership improves our relationship not only with our followers, but with the entirety of society and the world in which we live. Nature doesn't have leaders per se. We were vested with that authority, if you will. And we, as stewards and leaders of the world, should be taking these responsibilities a lot more seriously. So I'm just delighted to see the opportunities to bring together science, spirituality, religion, and the social relationships that we need to evolve in order to understand and take action that is so critical should have been taken decades ago. But we know now, thanks to people like Stu and Mike with TAP, we can see it visually, we can see it mathematically, we can see it scientifically, if you will. And this discussion that we're having today is so critical to helping us visualize, understand, appreciate, and begin to lay the kinds of collaborative associations that we need to correct and address and correct these issues.
At this point in our discussion, I asked Dr. Stuart Kauffman to explain more about the adjacent possible theory, which is known as TAP. And here's what he had to say.
Thanks, Janice. Well, I actually wrote down an equation about 5 years ago, and it's incredibly simple with very startling results. I was wondering, suppose that I'm in an economy and it has 40 goods in the economy now. What might it have in the next period, whatever period, say next year? Well, if the 40 things we have now work, we'll have them the next period. But we can make new things out of the 40 that we've already got. So let me bring this home. The Gutenberg press is a recombination between a wine press and movable type. The Wright brothers airplane is a recombination between 4 things: a light gas engine, bicycle wheels, a propeller, and an airfoil. So we most often make our new things by combining things we've already got. And we can take one thing and modify it, like a hammerhead, or we could take 2 things and try to make something new, or 10 things. Just think about jury rigging. Is it easier to jury rig with a bunch of broken things in the garage, or 1 thing? Well, a bunch of things in the garage, because you can fit them together in more ways. All this equation says is I've got M things at time t, say 40 things now, and next year I'm going to have these 40 things, and I'm going to take each of the 40 and try to make something new out of it. And I'm going to take every pair of the 40 things. Well, there's a lot more pairs chosen out of 40 things than single things. You can choose a single thing out of 40 things one way. You can choose, I don't know, a couple thousand of pairs of things, and a lot more of triplets of things, and so on. So this equation does something very strange. Then you have more things. What happens is, and there's theorems and all sorts of stuff now that prove what I'm going to say. If you start off with, for example, 10 things or 20 things, then for a very long period of time, nothing much happens. Then roughly all of a sudden, it explodes upward faster than exponential. Mathematically, it's hyperbolic. And the amazing thing is the continuous version of this equation reaches infinity at some finite time. It just goes vertical. And I had written it down, and Roger Koppel's a friend of mine, and he said, it looks like the Industrial Revolution. You have for me, Janice, a slide of GDP for the past 2,000 years, and it's flat for 2,000 years, probably 20,000 years, and it explodes about a century ago. It's going vertical now.
Right.
It can't keep going vertical on a finite planet. It can't. That means we confront the fact that it can't. But the economy is a juggernaut. We will make more concrete this year than last year to build yet more stuff to invade the planet ever more. And when it becomes a choice at COP26 to slow down, and we are afraid of putting people out of work, and we are,
Yes.
we're going to balk.
With good reason, because then we've seen what has happened even through the pandemic, and people not in recovery even as things are opening up. So that's a real concern.
Right. That's why this is such a huge challenge. This is the biggest challenge humanity has faced in our 300,000-year history. And there's a modest chance that we'll succeed if we can find hope beyond the terror of creating something better. So Mike and I talk all the time about roughly a new axial age. And the critical idea is that we're of nature, not above it. And let me just say this, if I may. Both Carl and Michael have talked about it. I've learned that the first words of the Old Testament can be read in 2 ways. God created heaven and earth and put Adam in charge and told him, to inherit the earth. That's a transcendent God, and we're at best stewards. At worst, we lay waste to it for our benefit. There's another meaning and of the very first words, that God creates. It's a continuous present. Well, if God creates a continuous creativity in nature, that's more like an immanent God. I'm not religious, but it's easy to fall in love with an immanent God, and then we are of the creativity of nature. And if we understand that in our guts and go out in the woods and walk around, we'll realize that we're so stupid to be destroying the biosphere. We're not its masters. We can't control it. We're its children. We just have to know it.
I think it begins with a different insight of who we are in the first place and who we're meant to be. And, dovetailing in what Stu is talking about with TAP, it's not just that, it's not just a tale of destruction. It's a tale of possibility, in that, 100 years ago, there was just a handful of things we could live our lives doing. And now each of us almost have a customized calling in terms of being a soul in all of this. And I would begin by saying, humankind has always lived between 2 regimes. And the one regime, I would describe it being centered on an idea, or centered on a dynamic of greed and cleverness. And the one we need to inhabit, and this is where Stu and mine's work really starts intersecting, is a regime that's centered on love and creativity.
A regime of love and creativity. Wow. That was something to ponder. And at that point, we were out of time for the first part of our discussion. So I asked Mike to plan to elaborate upon that in our part 2. And I want to invite you to join us for that. Again, I want to thank our guests, Dr. Carl Hunt, Dr. Stuart Kauffman, Minister Mike Gottschalk. And on part 2, Veronica Mata, who is another co-author of Paradoxes of Power, will join us as we continue our discussion about the climate crisis. So if you'd like to reach out to any of our guests from today, go to paradoxesofpower.com. And that's our show. I'm Janice Edwards. Thank you for all that you do to make our Bay Area and our world a better place. I appreciate you joining us, and I look forward to seeing you next time. If you'd like to reach out to us, please do so. It's thejaniceedwards.com. Thanks again. See you soon. Join us for part 2 of our show, focusing on our global climate crisis.
Now it's just becoming more prevalent. We're more of a bigger part of society. And I think we're realizing the things that we can actually do, other than just voting, to really change and help the environment. So a lot of people are cutting their meat, or a lot of people have been thrifting for a long time. I do that mostly. Most of my wardrobe is from thrift stores. I think a lot of people are cutting back on purchasing so much to really appreciate the things that we have and to not get to take advantage of what we still have on this planet. I think the shortages that we're seeing here is kind of a symptom of what Mike was just saying, our constant wants, or a little bit of our greed. We so many decades we've been able to just make and have whatever we wanted, and now we're realizing that that's not always the case, and that's not something that we necessarily need either.
Veronica and I also collaborated on an essay for this foundation to target it towards what can small communities, what can small towns do to be involved in lifting us up out of this morass in which we put ourselves and energize the functions of love, hope, and creativity. And in fact, the last essay is all about the types of hope that we can call on to move forward. Now that we understand, thanks to Stu and Mike and Veronica and the other essayists, now we have something that we can hang our future on through hope and love and creativity.